The blood on Margaret Sullivan's lip tasted of copper and shame, as her mother-in-law's hand connected with her face for the third time that morning, and she wondered if anyone in Ventura, California would hear her cries, or if they would simply turn away like they had been doing for the past 6 days since Thomas had been laid in the ground. "Enough of this wailing," Constance Sullivan hissed, her thin fingers gripping Margaret's black mourning dress so tightly the fabric strained. "You carry on like some common saloon girl, not the wife of my son. He has been dead nearly a week, and still you weep like a child." Margaret's hands trembled as she tried to wipe the tears from her swollen cheeks, but they kept falling despite her efforts to contain them. She was 22 years old and had been married to Thomas Sullivan for 3 years before the fever took him so suddenly that she barely had time to say goodbye. The grief sat heavy in her chest like a stone, making it difficult to breathe, and every time she thought she had no more tears left, they would come again in waves that threatened to drown her. "I loved him," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "How can I not mourn my husband?" The slap that followed was harder than the others, sending Margaret stumbling backward into the rough wooden wall of the small bedroom she had shared with Thomas. Her father-in-law, Walter Sullivan, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, his weathered face hard as the granite headstone they had placed over his son's grave. "You will stop this carrying on today," Walter said, his voice cold and unyielding. "You shame our family with your excessive grief. Thomas would not have wanted this." Margaret wanted to scream that they had no right to tell her how to grieve, that Thomas had been her husband and she loved him with every part of her being, but the words died in her throat when Constance grabbed her arm and dragged her toward the kitchen. The older woman's grip was surprisingly strong for someone so slight, and Margaret felt bruises forming under her fingers. "You have chores to do," Constance said. "The chickens need feeding and the washing needs to be done. Work will take your mind off this foolishness." Margaret stumbled through the rest of the morning in a haze of pain and exhaustion. Her cheek throbbed where Constance had struck her, and her arms ached from the rough handling. She fed the chickens with shaking hands and scrubbed the laundry until her knuckles were raw, but the tears kept coming despite her best efforts to hold them back. Every mundane task reminded her of Thomas, of the life they had been building together before death had stolen him away. By afternoon, Margaret could no longer bear the oppressive atmosphere of the Sullivan ranch. She needed to escape, to breathe air that was not thick with judgment and cruelty. When Constance went to lie down for her afternoon rest and Walter rode out to check on the cattle, Margaret slipped away from the house and walked toward town. The late summer sun of 1883 beat down on her black dress as she made her way along the dusty road, and sweat mixed with tears on her bruised face. Ventura was growing rapidly, the small coastal town transforming as more people arrived seeking opportunity in California. Margaret had come here 3 years ago as a bride, leaving her family in Missouri to start a new life with Thomas. Now she felt trapped, bound to his family by propriety and circumstance with nowhere else to turn. She found herself at the general store without quite meaning to, her feet carrying her to the familiar building where she and Thomas had often come together. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and the cool dimness inside was a relief after the harsh sunlight. Margaret moved between the aisles without purpose, her fingers trailing over bolts of fabric and jars of preserves as her mind wandered through memories. "Mrs. Sullivan." The voice was gentle and deep, pulling Margaret from her reverie. She looked up to find Jacob Barrett standing a few feet away, his hat in his hands and concern written plainly across his sun-bronzed face. She had seen him around town before, a cowboy who worked at one of the larger ranches north of Ventura, but they had never spoken beyond polite greetings. "Mr. Barrett," Margaret said automatically, then felt fresh tears spring to her eyes at the kindness in his expression. She turned away quickly, mortified to be seen in such a state by a stranger. "Are you all right, madam?" Jacob asked, and she heard him take a step closer. "Forgive me for being forward, but that looks like a nasty bruise on your face." Margaret's hand flew up to touch her swollen cheek, and she realized with horror that the evidence of Constance's violence was visible for anyone to see. Heat flooded through her, a mixture of shame and anger that made her want to run from the store and never return. "I am fine," she said, though her voice wavered and betrayed the lie. "Please, I would prefer not to discuss it." There was a long moment of silence, and Margaret thought perhaps Jacob had left. But when she dared to glance back, he was still standing there with that same expression of concern. He was tall and lean, with the weathered look of a man who spent his days working under the sun, and his dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that made him look younger than she suspected he was. His eyes were a striking blue-green, the color of the ocean on a clear day, and they held a gentleness that made something in Margaret's chest ache. "Mrs. Sullivan," Jacob said quietly, "I know it is not my place to say anything, but if you need help, there are people in this town who would offer it." The kindness in his words was too much. Margaret felt her carefully constructed composure crumble, and a sob escaped her throat before she could stop it. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying desperately to hold back the flood of emotion, but it was no use. The tears came in great heaving waves, and she found herself sinking down onto a barrel of flour as her legs gave out beneath her. She expected Jacob to leave, to be embarrassed by her display and make his excuses, but instead she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. He did not speak, did not offer empty platitudes or tell her to stop crying. He simply stood beside her and let her grieve, his presence a silent comfort in her storm of sorrow. When the worst of the crying had passed, Margaret looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I apologize," she whispered. "You must think me terribly weak." "Not at all," Jacob said firmly. "Grief is not weakness, Mrs. Sullivan. It is the price we pay for love." The words struck something deep within Margaret, and she found herself telling him things she had told no one else. She spoke of Thomas and how much she missed him, of the crushing weight of sorrow that sat on her chest every morning when she woke to find him gone. She told him about Constance and Walter, about how they had turned cold and cruel after their son's death, blaming her for grieving too openly and too long. "They say I shame the family," Margaret said bitterly. "They say I should be strong and move on, but how can I? Thomas was my whole world. We had plans for the future, dreams of children and a home of our own. All of that died with him." Jacob listened without interrupting, his hand still resting lightly on her shoulder. When she finally fell silent, he spoke with quiet conviction. "There is no shame in mourning the man you loved," he said, "and anyone who would strike you for it is wrong, plain and simple. You deserve better than that, Mrs. Sullivan." Margaret looked up at him, seeing real concern in his eyes, and felt something shift inside her. For the first time since Thomas's death, someone had validated her pain instead of dismissing it. Someone had offered her kindness instead of cruelty. It was a small thing, but in that moment it felt like everything. "Thank you," she said softly. "You cannot know how much it means to hear that." Jacob gave her a small smile. "I know what it is to lose someone you love," he said, "and I know how much it helps to have someone who understands. If you ever need to talk, or if you ever need help, you can find me at the Morrison Ranch. I am serious about that, Mrs. Sullivan. Day or night, you come find me if those people hurt you again." The sincerity in his voice made Margaret's throat tighten with emotion. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and Jacob gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze before stepping back. "Let me walk you home," he said, "or at least part of the way. I do not like the thought of you going back there alone." Margaret wanted to refuse, knowing that being seen with Jacob would only give Constance and Walter more ammunition against her, but the truth was she did not want to face them alone. So she accepted his offer with a nod, and together they left the general store and began walking back toward the Sullivan Ranch. They did not speak much on the walk, but the silence was comfortable rather than awkward. Jacob seemed to understand that Margaret needed quiet more than conversation, and he simply walked beside her with his long strides adjusted to match her slower pace. As they drew closer to the ranch, Margaret felt her anxiety increase, and Jacob must have noticed because he slowed to a stop. "This is probably far enough," he said. I do not want to cause you more trouble, but remember what I said, Mrs. Sullivan. If you need help, come find me." "I will," Margaret promised, though she wondered if she would have the courage when the time came. "And thank you again, Mr. Barrett. Your kindness has meant more than you know." Jacob tipped his hat to her, his eyes warm. "Take care of yourself, madam." Margaret watched him walk away, his tall figure growing smaller as he headed back toward town, and she felt a strange mixture of gratitude and loss. Then she turned and made her way to the Sullivan house, steeling herself for whatever awaited her inside. Constance was in the kitchen when Margaret entered, and the older woman's face darkened with suspicion when she saw her daughter-in-law. "Where have you been?" Constance demanded. "You disappeared without a word. Were you in town making a spectacle of yourself again?" "I needed some air," Margaret said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I went for a walk." "A walk," Constance repeated mockingly. "While there is work to be done here, you are lazy and selfish, Margaret. No wonder Thomas looked so tired all the time. He must have exhausted himself trying to make up for your lack of effort." The words cut deep, as they were meant to, but Margaret tried not to show how much they hurt. She had loved Thomas with everything in her, and she had worked hard to be a good wife to him. To hear Constance suggest otherwise was almost more than she could bear. "That is not true," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "I loved Thomas, and I did everything I could to make him happy." "Love," Constance spat the word like it was poison. "You speak of love as if it is some grand thing. But where is your love for us? We lost our son Margaret, our only child. And yet you carry on as if you are the only one suffering." Margaret stared at her mother-in-law, seeing the pain beneath the anger for the first time. Constance's eyes were red-rimmed and tired, and there was a hollowness to her face that spoke of sleepless nights and private tears. Walter was the same, Margaret realized, carrying his grief like a heavy burden that he tried to hide behind cold stoicism. They were hurting just as much as she was, but they had turned their pain outward, making Margaret the target of their rage and sorrow. "I know you are grieving too," Margaret said softly. "I do not mean to add to your pain, but please, Constance, do not ask me to pretend I am not hurting. Thomas was my husband. I loved him." For a moment something flickered across Constance's face that might have been understanding. But then it was gone, replaced by the familiar hardness. "Get out of my sight," Constance said coldly. "Go to your room and stay there. I cannot stand to look at you." Margaret fled to the small bedroom she had shared with Thomas, closing the door behind her and leaning against it as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. The room still smelled faintly of him, a mixture of soap and leather and something uniquely Thomas, and it made her heart ache with longing. She sank onto the bed and buried her face in his pillow, letting herself cry until she had no tears left. The next few days passed in a blur of misery. Constance and Walter barely spoke to Margaret except to give her orders or criticize her work. The tension in the house was thick enough to choke on, and Margaret found herself walking on eggshells, trying desperately not to provoke their anger. But no matter how hard she tried, it seemed she could do nothing right. Her meals were too bland or too seasoned, her cleaning not thorough enough, her demeanor either too mournful or not respectful enough. There was no winning with them, and Margaret felt herself growing smaller and more defeated with each passing day. It was on the 7th day after her encounter with Jacob that things came to a head. Margaret had been folding laundry in the kitchen when she came across one of Thomas's shirts, the blue one he had worn on their first anniversary. The sight of it hit her like a physical blow, and before she could stop herself, she was crying again, clutching the shirt to her chest as sobs racked her body. Constance found her like that, and the older woman's fury was instantaneous. "Still?" Constance shrieked. "Still you carry on like this? Have you no dignity at all?" She grabbed the shirt from Margaret's hands and threw it across the room, then grabbed Margaret by the hair and yanked her head back. Margaret cried out in pain, her hands flying up to try to loosen Constance's grip, but the older woman was beyond reason. She struck Margaret across the face once, twice, 3 times, each blow harder than the last. "You are pathetic," Constance hissed. "A weak, sniveling child. My son deserved better than you." Walter appeared in the doorway, and for a moment Margaret thought he might intervene. But instead he just watched with cold eyes as his wife continued to berate and strike her, his silence a tacit approval of the violence. "Please," Margaret begged, tasting blood in her mouth, "please stop." But Constance did not stop until she had exhausted herself, leaving Margaret huddled on the floor with her arms wrapped protectively around her head. When the blows finally ceased, Margaret heard Constance's ragged breathing above her. "Get out," Walter said from the doorway. "Pack your things and get out of this house. We do not want you here any more." Margaret looked up at him in shock, blood dripping from her split lip. "Where am I supposed to go?" "That is not our concern," Walter said flatly. "You have until sunset to leave. If you are still here after that, I will have the sheriff remove you." They left her there on the floor, and Margaret heard the door slam as they went outside. For a long moment she could not move, could not think beyond the pain radiating through her face and the terror of what they had just said. They were throwing her out with nowhere to go and no money of her own. She would be homeless, destitute, alone in a town where she knew almost no one. Then she remembered Jacob's words, "If you ever need help, you can find me at the Morrison Ranch. Day or night, you come find me if those people hurt you again." Margaret pushed herself to her feet, wincing at the pain in her ribs where Constance had kicked her. She gathered what few possessions she could call her own, stuffing them into a worn carpet bag with shaking hands. Her wedding ring glinted on her finger, and she touched it gently, drawing strength from the memory of Thomas's love. He would have been horrified by how his parents had treated her. He would have wanted her to be safe. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Margaret slipped out of the Sullivan house for the last time. She did not look back as she walked away, her bag clutched in one hand and her other arm wrapped around her bruised ribs. Each step was painful, but she kept moving, driven by the desperate need to find safety before night fell. The Morrison Ranch was north of town, about 3 miles from the Sullivan place. Margaret had never been there, but she knew roughly where it was from conversations she had overheard in town. She walked as quickly as her battered body would allow, her eyes scanning the landscape for landmarks. The coastal breeze carried the salt smell of the ocean, and seabirds wheeled overhead in the darkening sky. By the time Margaret spotted the Morrison Ranch buildings in the distance, the sun was touching the horizon and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Her legs were trembling with exhaustion and pain, and she felt lightheaded from lack of food. She had not eaten since breakfast, and Constance's beating had left her feeling weak and shaky. The ranch was larger than the Sullivan place, with a sprawling main house and several outbuildings, including a large barn and what looked like a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. Margaret could see lights glowing in the windows of the main house, and the smell of cooking food made her stomach clench with hunger. But she did not go to the main house. Instead, she made her way toward the bunkhouse, hoping to find Jacob there. Several men were sitting on the porch of the bunkhouse, smoking and talking in low voices. They fell silent when they saw Margaret approaching, their eyes taking in her battered appearance with varying expressions of surprise and concern. One of them, an older man with a grizzled beard, stood up and moved to intercept her. "Can we help you, madam?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I am looking for Jacob Barrett," Margaret said, her voice hoarse. "He said I could find him here if I needed help." The men exchanged glances, and the bearded man nodded toward the barn. "Jake is in there seeing to his horse. I will fetch him for you." "Thank you," Margaret whispered, and she sank down onto the porch steps, too exhausted to stand any longer. The men gave her space, though she could feel their eyes on her. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground, her hands clutching her bag as if it were a lifeline. A few minutes later she heard rapid footsteps, and then Jacob was there, dropping to one knee in front of her with alarm written all over his face. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said urgently, "what happened? Who did this to you?" Margaret tried to answer, but the words would not come. All the fear and pain and exhaustion of the past week came crashing down on her at once, and she began to sob uncontrollably. Jacob did not hesitate. He gathered her carefully into his arms, mindful of her injuries, and held her as she wept against his chest. His embrace was gentle and protective, and Margaret felt something inside her break open at the simple kindness of being held. "It is all right," Jacob murmured, one hand stroking her hair. "You are safe now. I have got you." Margaret clung to him, her fingers twisting in his shirt as she cried. She cried for Thomas, for the future they had lost, for the pain and cruelty she had endured at the hands of his parents. She cried until she had no tears left, and through it all, Jacob held her, his presence a steady anchor in her storm of grief. When she finally quieted, Jacob pulled back just enough to look at her face. His jaw tightened when he saw the extent of her injuries in the fading light. "Who did this?" he asked again, his voice low and dangerous. "Was it the Sullivans?" Margaret nodded, wiping at her eyes with trembling hands. "Constance beat me because I was crying over Thomas's shirt, and then they threw me out. Walter said if I was not gone by sunset, he would have the sheriff remove me." Jacob's expression darkened with anger, but when he spoke to Margaret, his voice was gentle. "You did the right thing coming here. Can you stand? We need to get you inside and have someone look at your injuries." With Jacob's help, Margaret got to her feet. He kept one arm around her waist to steady her, and she leaned gratefully against his solid warmth as they walked toward the bunkhouse. The other cowboys had disappeared inside, giving them privacy, but when Jacob led her through the door, they were waiting with supplies. The interior of the bunkhouse was simple but clean, with rows of narrow beds along the walls and a potbelly stove in the center. Someone had already set a basin of water and clean rags on one of the tables, and the bearded man who had greeted her earlier approached with a concerned expression. "I am Pete Carson," he said. "I have had some experience with doctoring over the years. May I take a look at your injuries, madam?" Margaret nodded, too tired to protest. Jacob helped her sit down at the table, and Pete began carefully examining her face and head. His touch was surprisingly gentle for such a large man, and he worked with practiced efficiency. "The cuts are not too deep," Pete said after a few minutes. They will heal clean if we keep them clean. "Do you have pain anywhere else, madam?" "My ribs," Margaret admitted. "Constance kicked me there." Pete's expression grew grim. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her side. Margaret nodded and carefully lifted her arm. Even through her dress, Pete could feel the tender spot where Constance's boot had connected, and he frowned. "I do not think anything is broken, but you will be badly bruised for a while. You need to rest and take it easy for the next few days. No heavy lifting or strenuous work." "I cannot afford to rest," Margaret said hopelessly. "I have no money, nowhere to stay. I need to find work." "You will stay here," Jacob said firmly. "The Morrisons are good people. I am sure Mrs. Morrison will be happy to have you up at the main house once she hears what happened." "I cannot impose," Margaret protested. "You have already done so much." Jacob crouched down beside her chair so he could look her in the eye. "Mrs. Sullivan, you are not imposing. You need help, and it would be my honor to provide it. Please let us take care of you." There was such earnestness in his voice that Margaret felt tears prick her eyes again. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and Jacob gave her a warm smile. "Good," he said. "Pete, finish cleaning her up. I am going to go talk to Mr. and Mrs. Morrison." Jacob left the bunkhouse, and Pete continued his ministrations, cleaning the blood from Margaret's face and applying a salve to the worst of the cuts. The other cowboys kept their distance, going about their evening routines with quiet respect for her situation. When Pete finished, one of the younger men brought her a plate of stew and a hunk of bread, which Margaret ate gratefully, despite her split lip making chewing painful. She had just finished eating when Jacob returned with a woman Margaret assumed was Mrs. Morrison. She was in her 50s with kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she swept into the bunkhouse with the air of someone used to taking charge. "You poor dear," Mrs. Morrison said, rushing over to Margaret. "Jacob told me what those awful people did to you. You will come stay with us at the house, of course. We have a spare room that hardly ever gets used, and you are welcome to stay as long as you need." "That is very kind of you," Margaret said, overwhelmed by the generosity. "But I cannot stay without working. Perhaps I could help around the house? I am a good cook, and I can clean and mend clothing." Mrs. Morrison waved a dismissive hand. "We can discuss all that later. Right now you need rest and recovery. Come along, dear. Let us get you settled." Margaret stood, wincing at the pain in her ribs, and Jacob immediately moved to support her. "I will help her to the house, sure," he said to Mrs. Morrison, and the older woman nodded approvingly. They made their way slowly across the yard to the main house, with Jacob bearing most of Margaret's weight. The interior of the Morrison home was warm and welcoming, with comfortable furniture and cheerful yellow curtains in the windows. Mrs. Morrison led them upstairs to a small bedroom at the back of the house that held a neatly made bed, a wardrobe, and a washstand. "This will be your room," Mrs. Morrison said. "There is fresh water in the pitcher, and I will bring you up a nightgown in a moment. Do you need anything else right now?" "No, thank you," Margaret said softly. "You have been more than generous." Mrs. Morrison smiled and patted her hand. "We take care of our own out here, dear. You rest now, and we will talk more in the morning." After Mrs. Morrison left, Jacob lingered in the doorway. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Sore," Margaret admitted, "but better than I was. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. I do not know what I would have done if you had not offered to help me." "Call me Jacob," he said. "And you do not need to thank me, Mrs. Sullivan. I meant what I said about grief not being weakness. What the Sullivans did to you was wrong, and you deserve better." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "Call me Margaret, then," she said. "I think we can dispense with formality after everything that has happened today." Jacob smiled, and the expression transformed his face from handsome to truly striking. "Margaret it is, then. I will let you rest. If you need anything during the night, my room in the bunkhouse is the third bed on the right. Do not hesitate to come get me." After Jacob left, Margaret changed into the nightgown Mrs. Morrison brought and climbed into bed. The sheets were clean and soft, and the mattress was far more comfortable than the one she had shared with Thomas at his parents' house. But despite her exhaustion, sleep was slow to come. Her mind kept replaying the events of the day, and she found herself thinking about Jacob's kindness, the way he had held her while she cried without judgment or expectation. She touched the wedding ring on her finger, feeling a mixture of grief and guilt. Thomas had been dead less than 2 weeks, and already she was noticing another man. What kind of wife did that make her? But even as the thought formed, she heard Jacob's voice in her mind. "There is no shame in mourning the man you loved." And somehow she knew that Thomas would not begrudge her seeking comfort from someone who showed her kindness. He had loved her too much to want her to suffer alone. Margaret fell asleep with tears on her cheeks, but with a small seed of hope beginning to grow in her heart. The days that followed developed into a gentle routine. Margaret healed slowly, the bruises fading from purple to yellow-green, and the cuts on her face scabbing over and beginning to heal. Mrs. Morrison, whose first name was Helen, fussed over her like a mother hen, bringing her meals in bed the first few days and insisting she rest. But as Margaret grew stronger, she began to help around the house, determined to earn her keep. She discovered that Helen was a warm and generous woman who had lost her own daughter to illness years before, and she seemed to take comfort in having another woman in the house. They worked together in companionable silence, cooking meals for the ranch hands and maintaining the household. Helen's husband, Robert Morrison, was a gruff but kind man who made it clear that Margaret was welcome to stay as long as she liked. But it was Jacob who drew Margaret's attention most often. He came by the house every evening after finishing his work, ostensibly to check on her recovery, but their conversations began to stretch longer as the days passed. They would sit on the porch in the cool evening air and talk about everything and nothing. Jacob told her about growing up in Texas, about coming to California 5 years ago seeking adventure and opportunity. He spoke of his own loss, a younger sister who had died when he was 17, and how it had shaped his understanding of grief. "My parents wanted me to move on quickly," Jacob said one evening, his voice quiet in the gathering dusk. "They said I needed to be strong for them, but I was hurting so badly I could barely breathe, and pretending I was fine only made it worse. It was not until I met an old ranch hand who let me talk about Sarah, who let me remember her out loud, that I began to heal." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she listened. "That is exactly how I feel," she said, "like I cannot breathe. The Sullivans acted as if my grief was an insult to Thomas's memory, but the opposite is true. I grieve because I loved him so much." "Tell me about him," Jacob said gently. "What was Thomas like?" So Margaret told him. She spoke of Thomas's laugh, which had been loud and infectious, and how he had loved to dance even though he was terrible at it. She talked about the small farm they had dreamed of buying, the children they had hoped to have, and as she spoke, she felt some of the weight lift from her chest. Jacob listened without interruption, his attention never wavering, and when she finally fell silent, he reached over and took her hand. "He sounds like he was a good man," Jacob said. "You were lucky to have each other, even if it was for too short a time." Margaret looked down at their joined hands. Jacob's calloused fingers wrapped gently around hers, and felt something shift inside her. It was not that her grief for Thomas had lessened. It was more that she was beginning to see beyond it, to imagine a future that held more than just endless sorrow. And Jacob was at the center of that imagined future, his quiet strength and gentle kindness calling to something deep within her. "Thank you for listening," she said softly. "No one else has let me talk about him like this." "You can talk about him whenever you need to," Jacob said. "He was important to you, which makes him important to me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she met Jacob's eyes and saw the warmth there, the careful tenderness that made her heart flutter in a way she had not expected to feel again so soon. They sat in silence for a long moment, hands still clasped, until Helen called from inside that supper was ready. Jacob released Margaret's hand with obvious reluctance, and they went inside to join the others. That night, lying alone in her bed, Margaret let herself acknowledge the truth she had been trying to ignore. She was developing feelings for Jacob. It felt too soon, too disloyal to Thomas's memory. And yet she could not deny the way her heart lightened when Jacob appeared each evening, or the comfort she felt in his presence. She twisted her wedding ring on her finger, torn between guilt and the tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find happiness again. As summer gave way to early autumn, Margaret settled more fully into life at the Morrison Ranch. She took over most of the cooking, discovering that she enjoyed feeding the hungry cowboys who worked the land. They were a good group of men, respectful and hard-working, and they treated her with a courtesy that made her feel valued. Pete became a particular friend, regaling her with stories of his younger days as she helped him mend torn shirts or patch holes in socks. But it was still Jacob who occupied most of her thoughts. Their evening conversations had become the highlight of her days, and she found herself watching for him from the kitchen window as the sun began to set. He was unfailingly kind and patient, never pushing her for more than she was ready to give, but she could sense his growing feelings in the way his eyes followed her and the gentleness of his touch when their hands accidentally brushed. One October evening, about 6 weeks after Margaret had arrived at the ranch, Jacob asked if she would like to go for a walk after supper. Margaret agreed, her heart beating faster at the prospect of time alone with him away from the house. They walked in comfortable silence along the fence line, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. "Margaret," Jacob said finally, stopping to face her, "I need to tell you something, and I hope you will not think badly of me for it." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "What is it?" Jacob took a deep breath, his hands fidgeting with the brim of his hat. "I have developed feelings for you, deep feelings. I know it has not been long since Thomas died, and I do not want to dishonor his memory or rush you into anything you are not ready for, but I cannot keep pretending that what I feel for you is simple friendship." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She had known this moment was coming, had felt it building between them for weeks. But hearing Jacob say the words out loud still made her heart race. She looked up at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that she might reject him. "Jacob," she said softly, reaching up to touch his face, "I have feelings for you too, and I feel so guilty about it, like I'm betraying Thomas somehow. He has only been gone 2 months." "Love does not follow a timeline," Jacob said gently, covering her hand with his. "And from everything you have told me about Thomas, I do not think he would want you to spend the rest of your life alone and grieving. He loved you too much for that." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks, but they were not entirely tears of sadness. "I loved him so much," she whispered, "and part of me will always love him. But I think I'm starting to love you too, and I do not know what to do with that." Jacob pulled her carefully into his arms, mindful of her still healing ribs. "You do not have to do anything with it right now," he said. "We can take this as slowly as you need. I am not going anywhere, Margaret. I will wait as long as it takes." Margaret rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She felt safe in his embrace, cherished in a way she had not felt since Thomas died. The guilt was still there, a small voice in the back of her mind telling her this was wrong, but it was drowned out by the warmth spreading through her chest and the certainty that Jacob meant what he said. "Thank you," she murmured against his shirt. "Thank you for being patient with me." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. When they finally walked back to the house, Jacob kept his arm around Margaret's shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling more at peace than she had in months. The following weeks saw their relationship deepen and grow. Jacob courted her properly despite living and working on the same ranch. He brought her wildflowers picked from the hills and sat with her in the evenings reading aloud from books borrowed from the Morrison Small Library. They took walks together whenever time allowed, exploring the beautiful California coastline and talking about their hopes for the future. Margaret found herself laughing again, something she had thought impossible in the dark days after Thomas's death. Jacob had a quiet sense of humor that caught her off guard, and he seemed to delight in making her smile. He was also remarkably patient with her moments of grief, never making her feel guilty when she had days where Thomas's absence hit her particularly hard. On those days, Jacob would simply hold her and let her cry, offering comfort without trying to fix her pain. One November afternoon, Margaret was in the kitchen making pies when Helen came in from town with news. The older woman's face was troubled, and she set her packages down on the table with more force than necessary. "I ran into Constance Sullivan in town," Helen said without preamble. "That woman had the nerve to complain about you to anyone who would listen. She is telling people you abandoned the family in their time of grief and are now living in sin with one of the Morrison ranch hands." Margaret felt her face flush with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "That is not true," she said hotly. "They threw me out after Constance beat me, and Jacob has been nothing but a gentleman. We are not living in sin." "I know that, dear," Helen said, patting her hand. "And I told Constance exactly what I thought of her lies. But you should be aware that she is spreading rumors. People in town are talking." Margaret sank into a chair, her hands shaking. She had known that eventually a word would get around about her staying at the Morrison Ranch, but she had hoped to avoid the kind of scandal that could ruin her reputation. In a small town like Ventura, gossip could be devastating, especially for a widow who was supposed to be in mourning. Jacob found her an hour later, still sitting at the kitchen table with tears on her cheeks. Helen had tactfully left her alone with her thoughts, but Margaret had been unable to shake the sick feeling in her stomach. When Jacob heard what Constance was saying, his face darkened with fury. "That vindictive woman," he said through clenched teeth, "she beats you and throws you out and then dares to question your honor?" "It does not matter if what she is saying is true," Margaret said miserably. "The damage is done. People will believe what they want to believe, and I will be seen as a fallen woman. Jacob knelt beside her chair and took both her hands in his. Then marry me, he said. Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. What? Marry me, Jacob repeated, his voice steady and sure. I know it is fast, and I know you are still grieving Thomas, but I love you, Margaret. I want to spend my life with you, and if marrying me will protect your reputation and give you security, then let us do it. Jacob, I cannot ask you to do that, Margaret protested. You deserve someone who can give you all of their heart, not someone who is still mourning another man. You are giving me your heart, Jacob said firmly. Maybe not all of it yet, but I can feel it growing between us, and I would rather have part of your heart now and the promise of more in the future than never have you at all. Marry me, Margaret, please. Margaret looked into his earnest face, seeing the love and determination there, and felt her resistance crumble. Jacob was offering her not just protection and respectability, but a future filled with kindness and affection. He was offering her a chance at happiness again, and she realized with sudden clarity that she wanted to take it. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I will marry you. The smile that spread across Jacob's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. He pulled her to her feet and kissed her forehead, then her cheeks, and finally, with exquisite gentleness, her lips. It was Margaret's first kiss since Thomas died, and for a moment she felt a pang of guilt. But then Jacob's arms tightened around her, and she let herself sink into the warmth of his embrace, into the promise of new love without forgetting the old. They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Ventura. Helen and Robert Morrison stood as witnesses, along with Pete and several of the other ranch hands. Margaret wore a simple blue dress that Helen had helped her sew, and Jacob wore his best suit with his hair slicked back and his boots polished to a shine. The pastor, an older man named Reverend Matthews, conducted the ceremony with quiet dignity, and when Jacob slipped a simple gold band onto Margaret's finger beside her wedding ring from Thomas, she felt tears slip down her cheeks. I promise to honor both your past and our future, Jacob whispered as he held her hands. Thomas will always be part of your story, and I will never ask you to forget him. Those words meant more to Margaret than anything else he could have said. She stood on tiptoe to kiss him as the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, and the small congregation applauded as Jacob swept her into his arms. The Morrisons hosted a small celebration dinner at the ranch, and Margaret found herself surrounded by warmth and well wishes. It was so different from her wedding to Thomas, which had been overshadowed by the Sullivans' cool disapproval, and she felt grateful for the genuine affection these people showed her and Jacob. That night, Margaret stood in the bedroom she now shared with Jacob, her hands trembling as she changed into her nightgown. She was nervous about the physical intimacy that would come with marriage, not because she had not been with a man before, but because this was different. This was Jacob, not Thomas, and it felt like crossing a threshold from which there was no return. Jacob entered quietly, his own nervousness evident in the way he moved. He stopped when he saw her standing by the window, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. We do not have to do anything tonight, Jacob said gently. I meant what I said about taking things at your pace. But Margaret shook her head. She crossed the room to him and placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her palm. I want this, she said. I want you, Jacob. I am ready. Jacob cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. He was patient and gentle, taking his time to learn what made her sigh and shiver, and when they finally came together, it felt like a completion, like two pieces fitting together to make something whole. Afterward, Margaret lay in Jacob's arms with her head on his chest, listening to his breathing slow as he fell asleep. She thought of Thomas, sending a silent prayer of thanks for the time they had shared, and then she let herself fully embrace this new chapter of her life. The winter months passed peacefully. Margaret thrived as Jacob's wife, finding joy in the small domestic routines of their life together. Jacob had moved into the main house with her, taking one of the spare bedrooms that the Morrisons had offered them until they could afford a place of their own. They spent their evenings by the fire, Jacob often falling asleep with his head in Margaret's lap as she read or mended clothing. Margaret still had moments of grief for Thomas, days where his absence hit her with renewed force, but Jacob was always there to support her, never jealous or resentful of her continued love for her first husband. He understood that grief was not something that disappeared with time, but rather something that became part of the fabric of a person's life, woven in with the joy and the sorrow and all the complex emotions that made up a human heart. In late January, Margaret realized she had not had her monthly courses in some time. At first, she thought it was stress or simply the changes her body had gone through in recent months, but when Helen noticed her feeling ill in the mornings and gave her a knowing look, Margaret had to face the possibility that she might be pregnant. The realization filled her with a complicated mixture of emotions. She was thrilled at the prospect of having a child with Jacob, but there was also fear and sadness. She had hoped to have children with Thomas, and the fact that she would now have them with someone else felt like another goodbye to the future she had imagined with her first husband. When she told Jacob, he was overjoyed. He pulled her into his arms and spun her around, laughing with pure happiness, and then immediately apologized and set her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "Margaret, you have made me the happiest man alive." Seeing his joy helped ease some of Margaret's complicated feelings. This was their child, a symbol of the love they had built together, and it deserved to be celebrated without the shadow of past sorrows hanging over it. "I am happy too," Margaret said, and she realized as she said it that it was true. Scared, but happy. "I will take care of both of you," Jacob promised. "Whatever you need, whatever it takes. You and this baby are my whole world." Margaret's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring. She continued to help Helen around the house, though both Helen and Jacob fussed over her constantly, trying to prevent her from doing anything strenuous. By May, her belly was round and obvious, and she felt the baby moving inside her, small flutters that grew stronger with each passing week. Jacob was attentive and loving, his hand constantly seeking out her stomach to feel their child kick. He talked to the baby every night, telling stories and singing silly songs that made Margaret laugh. His excitement was infectious, and Margaret found herself falling more deeply in love with him with each passing day. What had started as gratitude and affection had grown into something profound and true, and while she still carried Thomas in her heart, Jacob now occupied an equal space there. In June, about a year after Thomas's death, Margaret saw Constance Sullivan in town. The older woman was coming out of the general store as Margaret was going in, and they nearly collided on the steps. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, and Margaret saw Constance's eyes drop to her swollen belly. "You are pregnant," Constance said, her voice tight and strange. "I am," Margaret confirmed, lifting her chin defiantly. "My husband and I are expecting our first child in August." Something flickered across Constance's face, an emotion Margaret could not quite name. Regret, perhaps, or envy, or simply the pain of seeing someone else moving forward with their life while she remained trapped in grief. "I heard you married one of the Morrison ranch hands," Constance said. "That was fast." "It was necessary," Margaret replied, keeping her voice level. "Since you and Walter threw me out with nowhere to go?" Constance flinched, as if Margaret had struck her. "We were grieving," she said, but there was less conviction in her voice than Margaret remembered. "We were not thinking clearly." "You beat me," Margaret said quietly. "You punished me for loving your son enough to mourn him. There is no excuse for that, Constance." The older woman's face crumpled, and suddenly she looked small and old and broken. "I know," she whispered, "I know, and I am sorry. Not a day goes by that I do not regret what we did to you. You were a good wife to Thomas. He loved you so much, and we should have honored that by treating you with kindness. Instead, We let our own pain turn us into monsters. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had thought she would feel satisfaction at hearing Constance apologize, but instead she just felt sad. Sad for all of them, for the way grief had twisted them into hurting each other when they should have been supporting one another. Thomas would have been disappointed in all of us, Margaret said. In you and Walter for how you treated me, but also in me for not being strong enough to stand up to you. We all failed him in our own ways. You did not fail him, Constance said firmly. You loved him, and that is all he ever wanted. I am the one who failed. I lost my son, and then I drove away the woman he loved most in the world. Can you ever forgive me? Margaret looked at the broken woman in front of her and felt the last of her anger drain away. Holding on to rage and bitterness would not bring Thomas back, and it would not make her own life better. Forgiveness, she realized, was not about saying what Constance had done was acceptable. It was about releasing the hold that hurt had on her own heart. I forgive you, Margaret said softly, not for your sake, but for mine. I need to let go of the past so I can fully embrace my future. Constance nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered, and congratulations on your baby. I hope it brings you great joy. They parted ways, and Margaret went into the store with a strange sense of lightness. She felt as if she had closed a door on a chapter of her life that had needed ending, and now she could move forward without the weight of unresolved pain holding her back. When she told Jacob about the encounter that evening, he held her close and kissed her temple. I am proud of you, sir, he said. That could not have been easy, but you handled it with grace. I did it for us, Margaret said, placing her hand on her belly. For our family. I do not want our child to grow up in the shadow of old hurts and grudges. I want them to know love and forgiveness and all the good things that make life worth living. They will, Jacob promised. We will make sure of it. In late August, on a hot afternoon with the sun beating down on the ranch, Margaret went into labor. Helen and the town midwife attended her while Jacob paced anxiously outside the bedroom, driven from the room by Helen's firm instructions to stop hovering. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Margaret thought she could not endure another contraction. But then she would hear Jacob's voice through the door, offering words of encouragement, and she would find the strength to continue. Finally, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of gold and orange, Margaret's son entered the world with a lusty cry that announced his arrival to everyone within earshot. The midwife placed the squirming, red-faced infant in Margaret's arms, and she stared down at him in wonder, tears streaming down her face. Jacob burst into the room moments later, having finally overcome Helen's restraining hand, and stopped dead when he saw Margaret holding their son. The look on his face was one of pure awe and love, and he moved to the bed with careful steps as if afraid he might break the spell. We have a son, Margaret said, her voice choked with emotion. Jacob, look at him. He is perfect. Jacob sat on the edge of the bed and gazed down at the baby with wonder. He touched one tiny hand with his finger, and the baby's fingers curled around it instinctively. Jacob made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and when he looked up at Margaret, his eyes were shining with tears. He is beautiful, Jacob said. You are amazing. Thank you for giving me this gift. They named him Thomas Jacob Barrett, honoring both Margaret's past and present. Baby Thomas had his father Jacob's blue-green eyes and a shock of dark hair, and from the first moment he proved to have healthy lungs and a strong will. Margaret fell instantly and completely in love with her son, marveling at the miracle of his tiny fingers and toes and the way he looked at her with such trust. Jacob was a devoted father from the start. He took to fatherhood with the same gentle patience he showed in everything else, learning to change diapers and soothe the baby when he cried. Margaret would often wake in the night to find Jacob standing by the cradle, simply watching their son sleep with an expression of such tenderness it made her heart ache. As the months passed and Thomas grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, smiling baby, Margaret found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. A little over a year ago, she had been lost in grief, broken and alone, believing that her life was over. But through Jacob's kindness and love, she had found a reason to hope again. She had found a new family, a new purpose, and a new love that did not diminish what she had felt for her first husband, but rather added to the richness of her life. One evening in December, as they sat by the fire with baby Thomas sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Jacob turned to Margaret with a thoughtful expression. "I have been saving money," he said, "and I have been talking to Robert Morrison. There is a piece of land for sale about 5 miles south of here. Good grazing land with a creek running through it. I would like to buy it and start our own ranch. Nothing big at first, just a few head of cattle and some horses. But it would be ours, Margaret, a place where we could build a life for our family." Margaret felt excitement bloom in her chest. She had been happy at the Morrison Ranch, and Robert and Helen had been unfailingly generous. But the idea of having their own place, of building something together, was deeply appealing. "I think that is a wonderful idea," she said. "When could we do it?" "If all goes well, by next spring," Jacob said. "I've almost enough saved, and Morrison has agreed to help me with the loan for the rest. We could build a small house to start, just a couple of rooms, and add on as we can afford it." They spent the winter planning and preparing, and by April of 1885 they were ready to move. The land Jacob had purchased was beautiful. Rolling hills covered in spring grass with the creek he had mentioned running along the northern border. They spent the first few weeks living in a tent while Jacob and some of the men from the Morrison Ranch helped build a small house. It was simple but sturdy, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, a bedroom for Margaret and Jacob, and a small room for Thomas. Margaret threw herself into making their house a home, sewing curtains for the windows and planting a vegetable garden beside the house. Jacob bought a small herd of cattle and began building up their stock, working from dawn to dusk to get their ranch established. It was hard work, but there was joy in it, the satisfaction of building something together that was entirely theirs. Baby Thomas thrived on the ranch, growing strong and healthy in the fresh air and sunshine. By his first birthday, he was walking, toddling around on chubby legs and getting into everything. Jacob delighted in playing with his son, tossing him in the air and making him laugh with silly faces and sounds. Watching them together, Margaret felt her heart swell with love and gratitude. This was the family she had dreamed of, and while it looked different than she had once imagined, it was no less precious for that. In the fall of 1885, Margaret realized she was pregnant again. Jacob was overjoyed, though he immediately began worrying about her health and whether she was doing too much work. Margaret laughed at his fussing and assured him she was perfectly fine, but she secretly enjoyed his attentiveness. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in May of 1886, Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Helen Barrett, after Jacob's sister and Helen Morrison. Sarah was a quiet baby, content to watch the world with wide, serious eyes, and Thomas was fascinated by his new sister. He would sit beside her cradle for hours, singing to her in his toddler voice and offering her his favorite toys. Life on the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. The cattle business grew slowly but steadily, and by 1887 they were able to add on to the house, building 2 more bedrooms and a proper kitchen. They hosted dinners for the Morrisons and the Cowboys from their old ranch, and Margaret took pride in setting a good table and making their home a place of warmth and welcome. Margaret still thought of Thomas Sullivan sometimes, especially on the anniversary of his death or on days when something would trigger a memory. But the grief had softened with time, becoming a bittersweet ache rather than the crushing pain it had once been. She kept his photograph in a small frame on the mantel, and she told her children about him, about the good man their mother had once loved. Jacob never showed any jealousy or resentment about this. He understood that Thomas was part of Margaret's history, and he honored that by ensuring their children knew about him. In 1888, Margaret gave birth to twin boys, John and James, and the house was suddenly full of noise and chaos and laughter. Jacob hired a hand to help with the cattle so he could spend more time with his growing family, and Margaret often found herself surrounded by children, all clamoring for her attention at once. It was exhausting and overwhelming and absolutely wonderful. One evening in the summer of 1889, Margaret stood on the porch of their ranch house watching the sun set over the hills. Jacob came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked softly. Margaret leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body and the strength of his arms around her. She could hear the children playing inside, their laughter ringing through the house, and she thought about everything they had built together over the past 6 years. "More than I ever thought possible," she said honestly. "When Thomas died, I thought my life was over. I thought I would never be happy again. But you showed me that it was possible to love again, to build a new life without forgetting the past. You gave me hope when I had none, Jacob, and I will be grateful for that every day for the rest of my life." Jacob turned her in his arms so he could look at her face. "You gave me just as much, Himana," he said. "You taught me that grief is not something to be ashamed of, that love is worth the risk of pain. You made me a better man, Margaret, and you have given me a family beyond my wildest dreams." He kissed her then, slow and sweet, and Margaret wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the love and passion that filled her heart. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, "more than I can ever put into words." "I love you too," Margaret replied, "always and forever." They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear overhead. Then Thomas called from inside that Sarah had stolen his toy horse, and James was crying because John had pushed him, and Margaret and Jacob looked at each other and laughed. "Welcome to parenthood," Jacob said with a grin, and hand in hand they went inside to referee the chaos. The years continued to pass in a blur of hard work and family joy. The ranch prospered, growing from a small operation to one of the more successful in the area. Jacob proved to have a natural talent for ranching, and his reputation for fair dealing and quality stock spread throughout the region. They were able to hire more hands, and eventually they built a proper barn and outbuildings to support the growing operation. Margaret became known throughout Ventura for her kindness and generosity. She always had a meal for travelers passing through and a sympathetic ear for neighbors facing hard times. She involved herself in the community, helping to organize church, socials, and school fundraisers, and she used her own experience of grief and hardship to comfort others going through similar struggles. The children grew strong and healthy, each developing their own distinct personalities. Young Thomas, who went by Tommy to distinguish him from his namesake, grew into a serious boy with a deep love of animals and the land. Sarah was quiet and thoughtful, always with a book in her hand, dreaming of far-off places. The twins, John and James, were inseparable and utterly incorrigible, always getting into some mischief or another that had Margaret simultaneously laughing and despairing. In 1891, Margaret gave birth to their fifth and final child, a daughter they named Grace. She was a sunny, cheerful baby who smiled at everyone and everything, and her arrival seemed to complete their family perfectly. Jacob declared that their house was officially full to bursting, and Margaret laughingly agreed as she surveyed their brood of 5 children, all under the age of 8. One autumn day in 1893, Margaret was in town running errands when she encountered Walter Sullivan. She had not seen Thomas's father since the day Constance had apologized to her nearly 7 years ago. Walter looked older, his hair completely gray now, and his shoulders stooped, as if carrying a heavy burden. When he saw Margaret, he stopped dead in his tracks, his face going pale. "Margaret," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I wondered if I might speak with you for a moment." Margaret hesitated, old memories rising up to make her wary. But then she thought of all the years that had passed, of the full and happy life she had built, and she found she had no room in her heart for old grudges. "Of course," she said, gesturing to a bench outside the general store. They sat down, and for a long moment Walter simply stared at his hands. "Constance passed away last winter," he said finally. "The consumption took her, Before she died, she made me promise to find you and apologize for how we treated you. She carried the guilt of it with her to the grave, and she wanted to make amends if possible. Margaret felt a pang of sorrow for the bitter woman who had caused her so much pain. I am sorry for your loss, she said sincerely. Grief makes us do terrible things sometimes. I forgave Constance years ago, and I forgive you as well, Walter. Holding on to anger only hurts the person carrying it. Walter's eyes filled with tears. You are a better person than either of us deserved, he said. Thomas chose well when he married you. I only wish we had been wise enough to see that at the time. They talked for a while longer, and Margaret told him about her family, about the 5 children she and Jacob were raising. Walter listened with a wistful expression, and when they parted, he thanked her for her kindness. Your forgiveness means more than you know, he said. Perhaps now I can find some peace. Margaret walked back to where Jacob was loading their wagon, feeling as if a weight she had not known she was still carrying had finally lifted. Jacob took one look at her face and pulled her into his arms. Are you all right? He asked. I am, Margaret said, and she meant it completely. I am more than all right. I am free. That evening, as the family sat around the dinner table with all 5 children chattering at once and Jacob making silly jokes that had everyone laughing, Margaret looked around at the faces of the people she loved most in the world and felt overwhelming gratitude. Her life had not turned out the way she had once planned. She had lost her first love far too soon and had endured pain and cruelty that she would not wish on anyone. But through it all, she had survived. More than that, she had thrived. She had learned that the human heart had an incredible capacity for resilience and growth. She had learned that it was possible to honor the past while still embracing the future, to love again without diminishing the love that came before. Most importantly, she had learned that happiness was not a finite resource that could only be experienced once in a lifetime. It was something that could be found again and again in different forms and different people, as long as you had the courage to open your heart to it. Jacob caught her eye across the table and gave her a warm smile that still made her pulse quicken after all these years. She smiled back, her heart full to overflowing with love for this man who had seen her at her lowest and had offered her not pity but partnership, not judgment but understanding. He had let her grieve and held her close, and in doing so he had helped her heal in a way that no amount of time alone could have accomplished. After dinner, when the children had been tucked into bed and the house had finally fallen quiet, Margaret and Jacob sat together on their porch as they had done countless evenings before. The stars were bright overhead, and a cool breeze carried the scent of grass and cattle and the life they had built together. Do you ever regret it? Jacob asked quietly. Marrying me so soon after Thomas died? Taking a chance on someone you barely knew? Margaret turned to look at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, and she took his face in her hands. Never, she said firmly. Not for one single moment. You saved me, Jacob. Not just from the Sullivans or from poverty, but from drowning in my own grief. You showed me that life could be beautiful again, that I could be happy again. You gave me a family and a home and a love that I treasure more than anything else in this world. How could I ever regret that? Jacob pulled her close and kissed her with a passion that still took her breath away after nearly 9 years of marriage. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. You are my everything, he said. You and our children. I wake up every morning grateful that you said yes to me, that you took a chance on a cowboy with nothing but a dream and a determination to make you happy. You have made me happy, Margaret assured him. Happier than I ever thought possible. I love you, Jacob Barrett, with all my heart, for all my days. They sat together in the darkness, wrapped in each other's arms, and in the comfortable silence of 2 people who knew each other completely. Margaret thought back to that day in the general store when Jacob had first shown her kindness, when he had stood beside her and let her grieve without judgment. That moment had been the beginning of everything, the first step on a journey that had led her from the depths of despair to the heights of joy. She had learned so many lessons in the years since Thomas's death. She had learned that grief was not weakness, but a testament to love. She had learned that forgiveness was a gift you gave yourself as much as the person who had wronged you. She had learned that the heart had room for multiple loves, that honoring the past did not mean being trapped by it. Most of all, she had learned that happiness was always possible even in the darkest of times as long as you had someone willing to stand beside you and hold you close while you found your way back to the light. As the years continued to roll by, the Barrett family became a fixture in Ventura. The children grew into fine young adults, each pursuing their own dreams while remaining close to their parents and each other. Tommy took over much of the day-to-day running of the ranch, proving to have inherited his father's talent for ranching. Sarah became a teacher, opening a small school in town where she instilled a love of learning in generations of children. John and James went into business together, opening a supply store that served the growing community. And little Grace, true to her sunny nature, brought joy to everyone she met, eventually marrying a doctor and filling her parents' later years with grandchildren to spoil. Margaret and Jacob grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They faced challenges and hardships as all couples do, but they faced them together, their bond strong enough to weather any storm. And always Margaret kept Thomas Sullivan's photograph on the mantel, teaching her children and grandchildren about the young man who had been her first love, ensuring that his memory lived on not as a source of pain, but as a reminder that love, in all its forms, was worth celebrating. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Jacob surprised Margaret by taking her back to the spot where he had proposed to her all those years ago. They stood together watching the sunset, much older now, but no less in love, and Jacob took her hand. 25 years, he said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have been together forever. Both are true, Margaret said, leaning into his warmth. Every day with you feels new, but I also cannot imagine a time when we were not together. You are part of me now, Jacob, as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. And you are my heart, Jacob replied. Everything good in my life came from the day you walked into my life. I would do it all again in a heartbeat. They kissed as the sun dipped below the horizon, two people who had found each other in the darkest of times and had built a life full of light and love. And as the stars began to appear overhead, Margaret sent up a silent prayer of thanks to whatever force had brought Jacob into her life when she needed him most. She had lost Thomas Sullivan to death, had been beaten and cast out by his family for the crime of grieving. But a cowboy had let her grieve and held her close, and in doing so had given her a second chance at happiness. She had taken that chance and built a life more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. A life filled with love and laughter, and the quiet contentment that came from being exactly where you were meant to be. Years later, when Margaret was an old woman surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, someone asked her what advice she would give to someone who had lost everything and did not know how to go on. She thought for a long moment, her mind traveling back over the decades to that grief-stricken girl who had stumbled into the general store with a bruised face and a broken heart. I would tell them that grief is not something to be ashamed of, she said, that it is okay to hurt, okay to cry, okay to feel like the world has ended. But I would also tell them that the world has not ended, even though it feels that way. That somewhere out there is someone who will let them grieve without judgment, who will hold them close and help them find their way back to the light. And I would tell them to have the courage to accept that help when it comes, to open their heart to the possibility of new love without feeling guilty about the old, because the heart is big enough for all of it, for all the love and loss and joy and sorrow that makes up a human life. And happiness, real lasting happiness, comes not from avoiding pain, but from having the courage to feel it fully and then choose to keep living anyway. Those words, born from her own hard-won experience, became something of a legacy in Ventura. People would repeat them to friends facing loss, would draw strength from Margaret's story when facing their own dark times. And Margaret, holding Jacob's hand even in their twilight years, knew that every moment of pain had been worth it to arrive at this place of peace and contentment. On a warm spring morning in 1918, Margaret Sullivan Barrett passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 57, surrounded by the family she loved. Jacob held her hand as she took her last breath, tears streaming down his weathered face, and he whispered words of love that had sustained them through 35 years of marriage. At her funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives she had touched. They spoke of her kindness and generosity, her strength and resilience, the way she had turned her own pain into compassion for others. And when they laid her to rest in the cemetery overlooking the ranch she and Jacob had built together, they placed flowers from Thomas Sullivan's grave beside her, a final acknowledgement of the man who had first claimed her heart and whose memory she had honored even while building a new life. Jacob lived another 5 years, and those who knew him said he never quite recovered from losing Margaret. But he was not bitter or despairing. Instead, he spoke often of how lucky he had been to have her in his life, how grateful he was for every moment they had shared. He told anyone who would listen that Margaret had taught him what real love looked like, the kind of love that was strong enough to encompass past and present, loss and joy, grief and healing all at once. When Jacob finally joined Margaret in 1923, they buried him beside her with a headstone that read, "Together in love, forever in peace." And the story of their romance, of the cowboy who had let a grieving widow mourn and held her close, became the stuff of local legend, a tale of love triumphing over loss that inspired generations to come. Their children and grandchildren carried on the ranch, building on the foundation Margaret and Jacob had laid. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun was setting over the California hills, people swore they could see two figures standing together on the porch of the old Barrett homestead, hands clasped and heads close together, watching over the land they had loved and the legacy they had created. It was a fitting end to a story that had begun in grief but had blossomed into something beautiful. Margaret had learned that love was not a finite resource but an infinite wellspring that could be drawn from again and again. She had learned that the human spirit was capable of incredible resilience, that even the deepest wounds could heal given time and the right person to help tend them. And she had learned that sometimes the greatest love stories began not with passion and fireworks but with simple kindness, with one person seeing another's pain and choosing to stand beside them until the darkness lifted and the light returned. The Barrett Ranch still stands today, a testament to what can be built when two people choose love over fear, hope over despair. And on the mantel in the main house, carefully preserved by generations of descendants, sit two photographs side by side. One shows a young Thomas Sullivan, forever 25, his smile bright and his eyes full of dreams. The other shows Jacob and Margaret Barrett on their wedding day, their faces radiant with love and the promise of a future together. It is a reminder that the heart has room for all the loves of a lifetime, that honoring the past and embracing the future are not mutually exclusive. It is a reminder that grief, as painful as it is simply love with nowhere to go, and that the only cure for that pain is to find new places for that love to flow. Margaret Sullivan Barrett lived a full and happy life, loved deeply, and was deeply loved in return. She transformed her tragedy into triumph, her pain into compassion, her loss into a legacy of love that continues to inspire to this day. And it all began with a cowboy who saw a grieving woman and chose not to judge her tears, but to let her grieve and hold her close, giving her the space to heal and the support to find her way back to life. In the end, that is what love is really about. Not grand gestures or sweeping romance, though those have their place, but rather the simple, profound act of standing beside someone in their darkest hour and saying, "I see your pain. I honor your grief, and I will be here for as long as you need me until you are ready to smile again." That is what Jacob gave Margaret and what she gave him in return. It is a love story for the ages, proof that even in the wild and often harsh landscape of the American West, beauty and tenderness could flourish, and that broken hearts could heal and love again.